buried alive. That was the threat they faced as the thermometer plunged to -32, and the snow rose at an inch an hour. Facing certain doom, most men would have fallen to their knees to pray for a miracle. But Theodore Pendleton reached for a blowtorch instead. Refusing to let his family freeze, he set his sights upward, determined to construct a fortress in the sky. The Bitterroot Mountains of Montana do not forgive arrogance, but they are equally ruthless to the unprepared. For Theodore Pendleton, a 42-year-old former heavy machinery rigger, the trip to the family's newly purchased off-grid property was supposed to be a late autumn getaway. It was November the 14th. Historically, the area saw no more than a dusting of snow before Thanksgiving. Theodore's wife, Sarah, an emergency room nurse, had packed light. Their 12-year-old son, Leo, and 8-year-old daughter, Chloe, were dressed in standard winter coats, entirely unsuited for what the local meteorologists would later dub the Great White Collapse. The property sat at an elevation of 6,500 feet, 38 miles from the nearest town of Pine Ridge. The only structure was a half-rotted A-frame cabin Theodore had intended to gut and rebuild the following spring. At 4 p.m. on Tuesday, the barometric pressure didn't just drop, it plummeted like a stone in a well. The wind arrived first. It sounded like a freight train tearing through the ancient Douglas firs. Then came the snow. Not flakes, but a blinding, suffocating wall of white. Within 3 hours, the temperature crashed from a brisk 40 degrees down to a bone-shattering -10. Inside the A-frame, the Pendletons huddled around a cast-iron wood stove. The fire roared, but the cabin's degraded insulation meant the heat was sucked through the walls almost instantly. "Theodore, the radio," Sarah said, her voice tight with an edge of panic she usually reserved for the ER trauma bay. The battery-operated emergency radio crackled with static. The voice of David Kessler, the regional weather service dispatcher, cut through the noise, sounding frantic. "Historic anomaly. A stationary high-pressure system colliding with an Arctic trough. Expect localized snowfall exceeding 10 feet over the next 48 hours. Temperatures will reach -30. Do not attempt to travel. If you are not winterized, find subterranean shelter immediately." Then the signal died. 10 feet, Leo asked, his eyes wide, looking from the radio to his father. "Dad, the roof is leaking." It wasn't leaking water. It was leaking dust. Theodore looked up. The main cross-beam of the A-frame, weakened by decades of dry rot, was groaning under the rapidly accumulating weight of the snowpack. A sharp, explosive crack echoed through the room, louder than a gunshot. "Out!" Theodore roared, grabbing Chloe by the collar of her jacket. "Everybody out, right now!" Sarah seized Leo's arm, and the four of them smashed through the front door, just as the spine of the cabin gave way. The sound was deafening, a chaotic crunch of snapping timber, shattering glass, and collapsing shingles. A massive plume of white powder exploded outward, knocking Theodore off his feet. When the dust settled, the cabin was gone. In its place was a V-shaped crater of broken wood, rapidly being swallowed by the relentless blizzard. They were stranded. No shelter, no cell service. 38 miles to civilization, and the temperature was now -15 and dropping. "The shed!" Theodore yelled over the howling wind, pointing to a corrugated tin lean-to about 50 yards away. It had once housed an old diesel generator. They waded through waist-deep snow, the wind biting into their exposed faces like shards of broken glass. Inside the shed, the darkness was absolute. Theodore fumbled with his flashlight. The beam illuminated a stark, terrifying reality. The tin walls offered zero insulation. It blocked the wind, but it was essentially a meat locker. Sarah stripped off her own outer coat and wrapped it around Chloe, who was already shivering violently, her lips taking on a terrifying shade of blue. "Theodore," Sarah whispered, her breath forming thick clouds in the frigid air. "She's going into early-stage hypothermia. We can't stay in here. We won't make it to morning." Theodore knew she was right. The snow outside was piling up fast. By dawn, the drift would bury the shed entirely. If the cold didn't kill them, carbon dioxide poisoning under the snowpack would. He needed to get them above the snow line. He needed a structure that could withstand crushing weight and brutal cold. And he needed to generate heat without burning them alive. Theodore closed his eyes, his mind desperately scanning the topography of the 10-acre property. He visualized the rusted junk left behind by the Miller & Sons logging company in the 1920s. Suddenly, his eyes snapped open. "The boiler," he said. 100 yards from the ruined cabin sat a colossal relic of the industrial age, a pneumatic steam boiler tank from a steam-powered logging donkey. It was a massive iron cylinder, 15 feet long and 8 feet in diameter, forged from 3/4-inch thick steel. It weighed roughly 2 tons. Next to it stood the skeletal remains of an old water tower base. 4 vertical, 12-foot-tall H-beams driven deep into the bedrock. Theodore's plan was utter madness, born of absolute necessity. If he could hoist that 2-ton iron cylinder onto those 12-foot steel pillars, he would create an impenetrable, elevated bunker. The snow would blow right under it, preventing them from being buried. More importantly, iron is a brilliant thermal conductor. If he could elevate the tank, he could build a massive bonfire on the ground directly beneath it. The heat would rise, turning the iron floor of the cylinder into a giant, radiant heater. "I'm going to get the cylinder," Theodore said, zipping his coat tight. "Sarah, keep the kids moving. Do jumping jacks. Do whatever it takes to keep the blood flowing." Theodore stepped out into the raging whiteout. The cold was a physical assault, punching the air from his lungs. He trudged toward his 1998 Ford F250. It was nearly buried, but he didn't need it to drive. He needed the 12,000-pound PTO winch mounted to the front bumper. He grabbed his heavy tool bag from the truck bed, slinging it over his shoulder. The wind chill was approaching -40. Every breath felt like inhaling razor blades. He reached the iron tank. It was half buried. Theodore spent 30 agonizing minutes digging out the heavy steel towing loops welded to the top of the cylinder. His fingers, even inside his thick leather gloves, felt numb and clumsy. Next came the rigging. Theodore was a master rigger, but he was working in the dark, in a blizzard, with gear that hadn't been load-tested in a decade. He dragged the heavy steel winch cable through the snow, running it up and through a heavy-duty snatch block he hooked to the top of one of the 12-foot H-beams. He routed the cable back down to the cylinder. It was a complex compound pulley setup designed to double the pulling power of the winch. It had to be perfect. If the cable snapped under the 2-ton load, it would whip through the air with enough force to cut a man in half. He waded back to the truck. He turned the key. The diesel engine groaned, sluggish from the cold, but mercifully caught. He engaged the winch. Clack, clack, clack. The steel cable went taut, humming like a giant guitar string. Slowly, agonizingly, the massive iron cylinder groaned against the frozen earth. It shifted, breaking free of the ice with a sound like tearing metal. Inch by inch, the cylinder began to rise. 3 feet. 6 feet. Theodore stood near the H-beams, operating the winch via a wired remote, watching the rigging. The wind screamed, battering the suspended iron tank, causing it to sway violently. Suddenly, a loud ping echoed over the storm. Theodore froze. He shone his flashlight up at the snatch block. The steel pin holding the pulley wheel was bending under the dynamic load of the swinging cylinder. "Hold together," Theodore whispered through chattering teeth. "Just hold." The cylinder reached 10 feet, 11 feet. It was nearly level with the top of the H-beams. Snap! The sound was followed immediately by a horrific shriek of unspooling metal. One of the secondary guide cables gave way. The 2-ton iron cylinder swung wildly to the left, crashing into the steel pillar with a deafening clang. Sparks showered down into the snow. The entire water tower structure shuddered, but the H-beams held. Theodore ducked, narrowly avoiding a piece of shrapnel from the broken guide wire that embedded itself into the trunk of a nearby pine. His heart hammering against his ribs, Theodore stabilized the load. He used the remaining tension to maneuver the cylinder until it rested squarely atop the 4 steel pillars. He scrambled up a rusted side ladder, pulled heavy U-bolts from his bag, and feverishly locked the tank to the beams, tightening the nuts with an impact wrench until his arms burned. It was secure. He had an iron cylinder suspended 12 feet in the air. Now, he needed to get inside. He fired up his portable angle grinder, powered by a heavy extension cord run from the truck's inverter. He attacked one end of the cylinder. Sparks flew in a blinding arc, battling the snowflakes in mid-air. He cut a rough 3-foot square opening, kicking the heavy steel plate inward. It was hollow, dark, and smelled faintly of rust and old earth. But it was completely shielded from the wind. Theodore scrambled down. He grabbed a massive tarp from his truck, a fiberglass insulation roll he had bought for the cabin, and 2 bundles of dry firewood he had covered with a tarp yesterday. He ran to the tin shed. Sarah was clutching Chloe, her face pale, tears freezing on her cheeks. Leo was pacing, trying to keep warm. "We're moving," Theodore commanded. "Now!" He practically carried Chloe through the blizzard. When they reached the towering iron structure, Theodore hoisted Leo up the rusted ladder, then climbed up carrying Chloe, passing her into the dark opening. Sarah followed closely behind. Inside the iron belly, the roar of the storm was muffled to a dull, rhythmic thrumming, but it was still freezing. "Line the walls with the fiberglass," Theodore instructed Sarah and Leo, handing them the rolls and a heavy-duty stapler, trusting the rust and grime to hold the adhesive tape he also provided. "Make a nest in the center with the blankets." Theodore didn't stay inside. He climbed back down into the raging storm. He gathered the dry firewood and piled it directly underneath the suspended iron tank. He doused it in diesel fuel from a jerry can and struck a match. The fire roared to life, a brilliant beacon of orange in the terrifying whiteout. Theodore climbed back up into the cylinder and pulled the heavy steel plate back into place to block the wind. He knelt on the curved iron floor and placed his bare hand against the metal. For 10 minutes, nothing. The cold remained absolute. Then slowly, miraculously, the steel beneath his palm began to change. The chill faded. The metal grew tepid. Then it grew warm. Because heat rises, the massive bonfire roaring 12 feet below them was transferring its thermal energy directly into the belly of the iron cylinder. The thick steel absorbed the heat and radiated it upward. "Come here," Theodore said softly. Sarah, dragging the kids in their cocoon of blankets, slid to the center of the tank. Chloe laid her head on the iron floor. "It's warm," Chloe whispered, closing her eyes. "Daddy, the floor is warm." Outside, the temperature hit 30 below zero. The snow raged, piling up higher and higher, threatening to swallow the world. But 12 feet above the snowline, inside their floating iron fortress, the Pendleton family huddled together on a heated floor, safe from the freezing death below. But their trial had only just begun. The fire below wouldn't burn forever, and the storm was just getting started. By 2 a.m., the temperature inside the suspended iron cylinder had stabilized at a miraculous 55 degrees. Compared to the negative 35 raging outside, it felt like a tropical oasis. Sarah had fashioned a makeshift bed from the fiberglass insulation, carefully wrapped in their heavy tarp to prevent skin contact, and piled the emergency blankets on top. Leo and Chloe were finally sleeping, their breathing slow and steady, the terrifying blue tint gone from Chloe's lips. But Theodore was wide awake. He sat cross-legged near the rough-cut entrance, a heavy canvas drop cloth pulled tight across the opening to block the relentless wind. He listened. To a seasoned rigger, metal speaks. The 3/4-inch steel of the tank was expanding and contracting with the extreme temperature differential. Searing heat hitting the bottom, Arctic cold battering the top. It popped and groaned, a symphony of structural stress. It wasn't the metal failing that worried Theodore. The tank could withstand pressures far beyond a campfire. It was the silence between the gusts of wind. The storm was changing. Theodore pulled back the edge of the canvas. The beam of his flashlight cut into the void, illuminating a terrifying reality. The snow wasn't just falling. It was piling up at an incomprehensible rate. The 12 feet of clearance beneath the tank was gone. A massive curving drift had swallowed the H-beams and was steadily sealing off the space beneath the cylinder, forming a massive snow cave around the bonfire. "Theodore," Sarah whispered in the dark, her voice laced with the hyper-vigilance of an ER nurse. "What's wrong?" "The snow is building a wall," Theodore replied grimly. "It's insulating the fire, which is why it got so warm in here, but it's also choking it. If the fire loses its oxygen supply, it'll snuff out. And worse." Before he could finish the sentence, a thick, acrid tendril of grey smoke slipped past the canvas flap. Chloe coughed in her sleep, a dry, hacking sound. "Carbon monoxide," Sarah said, instantly sitting up, her professional instincts overriding her exhaustion. "If the snow seals off the bottom, the exhaust has nowhere to go. It'll pool, rise, and seep right into this tank. We'll go to sleep and never wake up." The iron lung, their salvation, was on the verge of becoming a gas chamber. "I have to go back down," Theodore said, already reaching for his frozen, stiff leather gloves. "I need to dig an intake trench for the fire to breathe, and an exhaust chimney to vent the smoke away from our door." "You can't go out there," Sarah argued, grabbing his forearm. "It's -40 with the wind chill, your core temperature. If I stay, we all suffocate. If the fire dies, we freeze." Theodore looked into his wife's eyes, his expression hardened by absolute resolve. "Keep the kids awake. If they start acting confused or lethargic, get them near the door and force fresh air into their lungs, no matter how cold it is. I won't be long." Theodore squeezed through the opening. The descent down the icy, rusted ladder was treacherous. The wind whipped at him, tearing the breath from his mouth. When his boots hit the snowpack, he sank waist-deep. The world was a blinding, chaotic vortex of white. He waded painfully toward the space beneath the cylinder. The heat radiating from the snow cave was intense, a bizarre juxtaposition against the freezing air. The fire was surviving, but just barely, struggling for air in its shrinking, icy cavern. Theodore grabbed an old snow shovel from the bed of his buried truck. He began to dig. Every scoop was an agony of exertion. The air was so thin and cold it felt like inhaling broken glass. His muscles, already pushed to their absolute limits during the rigging, screamed in protest. He dug a deep, narrow trench, angling downward into the snow cave, a fresh air intake. Almost immediately, the dying embers roared back to life, feeding on the rush of oxygen. But the smoke was still an issue. It was billowing wildly, swirling up the sides of the iron tank toward the door. Theodore needed a chimney. He looked around wildly. His eyes landed on the ruined A-frame cabin. Protruding from the massive snowdrift was a 10-foot section of 6-inch galvanized HVAC ducting that had survived the roof collapse. It was 50 yards away. It felt like 50 hauls. Theodore waded into the deep snow, using his shovel to clear a path. His vision blurred at the edges. Hypothermia, he realized sluggishly. His body was pulling blood away from his extremities to protect his organs. His fingers and toes were entirely numb. He reached the ruined cabin and wrenched the ducting free with a feral grunt. Dragging it behind him like an anchor, he fought his way back to the iron cylinder. He jammed one end of the ducting directly over the hottest part of the fire, angling the pipe outward through the snow wall and curving it downwind. It was a crude exhaust manifold, but it worked. The thick wood smoke immediately drew up the pipe, jetting out into the storm, safely away from the cylinder's entrance. Theodore stumbled backward, his task complete. But his legs suddenly refused to hold his weight. The adrenaline that had sustained him evaporated, leaving nothing but profound, bone-deep exhaustion. He collapsed backward into the snowpack. The white powder felt surprisingly soft, terrifyingly warm. A dangerous, seductive sleepiness washed over him. Just a minute, he thought. I'll just rest my eyes for 1 minute. Dad! The voice was faint, barely cutting through the howl of the wind. Dad, grab the line! Theodore forced his eyes open. Dangling 3 feet above his face was the thick steel hook of the winch cable. Above, silhouetted in the rough-cut door of the iron cylinder, was his 12-year-old son, Leo. The boy had braved the wind, dragging the heavy winch line from the truck bumper up into the tank, and had thrown it down to his father. Theodore, grab it! Sarah's voice echoed, frantic and sharp. Summoning the absolute last reserve of his strength, Theodore lunged forward, hooking his thick forearm through the steel loop. Pull! Theodore rasped, though he knew they couldn't hear him. Above, Sarah and Leo hauled back on the heavy steel cable with everything they had. Slowly, Theodore was dragged up the face of the snowdrift, his boots scraping against the rusted ladder, until strong hands grabbed his collar and hauled him over the steel threshold. He collapsed onto the warm iron floor, gasping for air. Sarah was immediately on him, stripping off his frozen outer layers, wrapping him in the heavy canvas drop-cloth, and pressing her own warm body against his shivering frame. You're okay, she wept, holding his face. The smoke is gone. The floor is hot. You did it, Theodore. You did it. Outside, the storm raged on, completely indifferent to the human struggle. But inside the belly of the iron beast, the Pendleton family huddled around the beating heart of their father's ingenuity and waited for the dawn. Time lost its meaning inside the tank. Without watches or natural light, they existed in a liminal space dictated only by the rhythmic thrum of the storm and the comforting, radiant heat beneath them. Sometime during the indeterminate hours, the ferocious howling outside began to shift. The aggressive, chaotic battering against the steel morphed into a steady, muted rushing sound. Then eventually, the rushing faded into an eerie, profound silence. Theodore, whose shivering had finally subsided, cracked his eyes open. A sliver of pale, blinding light was piercing the edge of the canvas door flap. "Sarah," he rasped, his throat raw from the smoke and cold air. She was already awake, clutching Chloe. Leo was stirring, rubbing his eyes. Theodore pushed himself to his feet. Every joint in his body felt like it had been packed with crushed gravel. He limped to the door, grabbed the edge of the heavy canvas, and pulled it aside. The sight that greeted him stole whatever breath he had left. The world he knew the day before had been erased. The towering Douglas firs were buried up to their midsections. The ruins of the A-frame cabin were entirely gone, hidden beneath a smooth, unbroken sea of brilliant white. The corrugated tin shed, where they would have undoubtedly frozen to death, was buried under 14 feet of snow. And the iron cylinder, it was no longer suspended 12 feet in the air. The snowpack had risen so high that the ground level was now flush with the bottom of the tank. They weren't floating in the sky. They were sitting perfectly level on top of a new, terrifyingly high horizon. If Theodore hadn't hoisted the 2-ton tank onto the 12-foot H-beams, they would currently be buried under 12 feet of compacted snow, crushed by the sheer weight or suffocated in the dark. His mad, desperate engineering had been exactly enough. Not a foot to spare. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, standing behind him, staring out at the devastating beauty of the frozen wasteland. "Theodore, the whole world is gone." "We're still here," Theodore said firmly. Survival, however, was only the first phase. Rescue was the second. They had no food, limited water, melted snow in a tin cup, and the fire beneath them, buried deep in its snow cave, was running out of fuel. Theodore turned back to the gear he had hauled up. The emergency radio. During the freezing panic of the cabin collapse, the alkaline batteries had died from the extreme cold. But sitting on the heated iron floor for 12 hours had fundamentally changed the battery chemistry. Heat restores voltage. Theodore clicked the power dial. A sharp hiss of static filled the cylinder. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. He keyed the microphone. "Mayday! Mayday! This is Theodore Pendleton. We are stranded at the old Miller property, elevation 6,500 on the North Ridge. We need immediate medevac. Over." Silence. Just the crackle of empty airwaves. "Mayday! Mayday! Is anyone listening?" For 5 agonizing minutes, Theodore broadcasted into the void. He was about to power down to conserve the battery when a voice cut through the static, distorted but loud. "Copy, Pendleton. This is Captain Thomas Mercer with the Bitterroot Search and Rescue. Do you read? Over." Sarah let out a choked sob. Leo pumped his fist in the air. "Loud and clear, Captain Mercer," Theodore shouted into the radio. "We are alive. 2 adults, 2 children. We are stable but out of supplies. Pendleton, we have aerial recon in your sector, but they can't see anything. The property looks completely buried. The snowpack up there is reading 14 feet. Are you in a subterranean air pocket? Do you need us to dig? Over." Theodore looked out the door, across the endless ocean of white, and smiled a tired, broken smile. "Negative, Captain. No digging required. Look for the big iron tank sitting right on top of the Snowline. We'll leave the porch light on for you." 3 hours later, the rhythmic thumping of rotor blades echoed off the mountain face. A bright orange Sikorsky HH-60 Jayhawk helicopter broke through the lingering cloud cover, hovering over the property. Down below, the SAR team was baffled. They had expected a gruesome recovery mission. The weather models had predicted a 100% fatality rate for anyone caught above 5,000 feet without a bunker. Instead, they found the Pendleton family waving from the doorway of a massive industrial boiler, perched immaculately on the surface of the snow. When the rescue basket was lowered, Captain Mercer, a rugged man with frost in his beard, hopped out onto the compacted snow. He looked at the massive iron cylinder, then kicked away some snow near the edge, revealing the top inches of a heavy steel H-beam. He looked under the tank, seeing the deep, excavated trench leading down to the remnants of a wood fire, 12 feet below the surface. Mercer stared at Theodore, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and profound professional respect. You rigged a 2-ton steam boiler 12 feet into the air, in the middle of a historic whiteout, and built a radiant floor heating system to beat a negative 30-degree freeze, Mercer asked, his voice hushed beneath the roar of the helicopter. Theodore pulled Sarah close, his arm wrapping tightly around her shoulders as they watched Leo and Chloe get strapped into the hoist basket. "I'm a rigger, Captain," Theodore said simply, his voice rough but filled with quiet pride. "I couldn't let my family fall." By nightfall, the Pendletons were safe in a warm hospital room in Pine Ridge. They were treated for minor frostbite and dehydration, but walked away fundamentally unscathed. Theodore's iron cylinder remains on the mountain to this day. The locals call it the Pendleton Fortress. It stands as a permanent, rusting monument to human ingenuity, the fierce protective instincts of a father, and the absolute refusal to surrender to the cold. If this incredible story of human resilience, quick thinking, and a father's unstoppable drive to protect his family left you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button. Don't forget to share this video with someone who loves intense, true survival stories, and subscribe to our channel for more jaw-dropping tales of ordinary people conquering the impossible. Your support helps us bring more of these amazing, real-life triumphs straight to your feed.